Clare Thorpe is the Associate Director Library Experiences here at the University of Southern Queensland. She's worked in academic and state libraries since 2001, using evidence-based approaches to develop and apply best practice in collection management, user experience, staff development and information literacy. Clare's professional achievements include Australian Library and Information Association's Metcalfe Award for Early Career Development in 2005 and the Queensland Library Achiever of the Year 2016. Fabulous. And today we're very lucky to have Clare here to talk about evidence-based practice and their experiences here at USQ. So
thank you, Susan. I feel a bit of a fraud because I think Julie's known me since the beginning of my career, and it sounds very impressive, doesn't it?
It does. It sounds really impressive. Yes, so Griffith University gave her a launching pad.
You did, yes.
So that's where I went wrong. I should have left Griffith. No.
Recording, by the way.
No, Adam, that's not for the minute. Anyway, moving on. Just before we get started, so I'd like to welcome Julie and Susan here to Springfield. Thank you for coming out, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today. So Springfield sits on the land of the Jagera, Yugara and Yugarabal people of Ipswich and Springfield regions, and I'd like to acknowledge their contribution to knowledge and culture and country here at USQ. So thank you for inviting me to talk about evidence-based practice, and I have brought Linda with me today and also Tricia because Susan, when we talked about this, really wanted to know, I guess, about how we're doing it here, and I can, I guess, provide the strategic why we do it, but I thought it's good to have people in the room who are actually living that experience. So I'm sure they'll be happy to answer any questions that you have, and please, just wave on the screen if you want to stop me as we go through as well. So I thought I'd start a little bit about my personal journey with evidence-based practice. So as Susan mentioned, I started working at Griffith University at the Gold Coast in 2001. So it's like my 21st century career, isn't it? And I don't have a research degree. I do not have a PhD, so I'm not a qualified researcher. So that's just my disclaimer to start off with. But what I do describe myself is a research practitioner. So I'm someone who's working in applying research methods to solve problems in my local work environment. So that's how I describe myself. Most of this is due in credit to one of my colleagues and mentors, Professor Helen Partridge, who also works here at USQ. So back in 2004, Helen approached me and said, I'm co-chairing a conference. It's called the Evidence-Based Librarianship Conference. Would you like to help organise it? And I went, well, I've never been on an organising committee, and I have no idea what that's all about, and I have no idea what evidence-based practice is, but why not? So I got involved in organising this conference, which was held in Brisbane in 2005. So it was the third in a series of biennial conferences that had started in 1997, no, not 1997, 2001, sorry. So it was the first time in the Southern Hemisphere, and it was a bit of a steep learning curve for me to understand what this evidence-based practice stuff was all about. So shortly after that, Helen came to me and said, look, I'd like to learn how to use phenomenography as a research tool. She's by trade a quantitative researcher, but she wanted to start exploring some qualitative approaches, and she said, would you like to do this for just on the side? I was like, oh, sure. I had no children at that point, so lots of energy. And so we did a small research project interviewing 6 information professionals around their experience of evidence-based practice using phenomenography as an approach. That's the little citation gift that keeps on giving, and has probably set me up for a few things further along in my career. And then a couple of years later, Helen said, you know what, let's bring the Evidence-Based Practice Library back to Brisbane, and we did it again in 2015 because we'd forgotten how much hard work it was 10 years previously. So that's kind of the professional engagement side of where I first got involved in this. But what it has done is really taught me a lot about how these approaches actually make me a better library professional and library leader. I guess my natural way of being, if you look at my Myers-Briggs, is to be intuitive, to make decisions based on assumption, by being evidence-based in my work, I have to challenge those assumptions and I have to make decisions based on evidence. And so that makes me a much better library leader. Okay, so that's my personal story. So moving on to, I guess, what we do here. Oh, and yes, I did another small research project with Elisa Howlett, who's based here at USQ just recently, which I'll talk about as we go through the presentation. And that work was presented at the most recent Evidence-Based Library and Information Practice Conference in Glasgow, and we won an award, so I like to just, yeah, that's exciting. So, evidence-based practice. So, within libraries, this term has been kicking around since about 1997. So it came into our profession from the health sciences. So librarians who were working in health science, supporting clinicians to be evidence-based practice in the 1990s went, this makes a lot of sense, why are we not doing this ourselves as professionals? So it came in by the health librarianship track, and many other disciplines now use evidence-based. So if you look at the literature in things like career development, executive coaching, public policy, governance, education, it's very big in the education area, in teaching and learning. You'll see that a lot of professions now have evidence-based practice as one of the things that define them as a profession. So the definition that we have on screen is the one that we use to define what evidence-based practice is here at USQ. So it's a structured process of articulating questions or problems, collecting, interpreting and applying valid and reliable evidence to support decision-making and continuous service improvement in professional practice. And hopefully you're all reading that and going, that's exactly what I do in my job. Okay, so we're not reinventing the wheel. Most of you are probably already acting this way. We're just, I guess, giving you a label for it. So our definition is not based, is not limited to gathering data or metrics. It's not just about analytics and stats. What it is an approach that's ongoing and reflective in nature. It's an approach to continuous service improvement and to professional practice. So I thought just give you a little bit of the theory and, that exists to talk about, I guess, the evidence-based from our own industry. So one of the existing models that was developed by Alison Brettle from the UK is called the 5 A's. This is my version of it. And because most of you are working closely with researchers, you'll see this very similar to an action research model, for example. So Alison defined the 5 A's as a circular process where you articulate a problem, you assemble the evidence, you assess the evidence for validity and reliability, you apply the evidence or you make a decision based on the evidence, and then you review and adapt. So it's an iterative process, similar to an action research type cycle. You'll notice that I've added my own extra step in there, which is communicate. And one of the things that I think is really important about being an evidence-based practitioner is that we do contribute back to the evidence base of our own profession. So while we might work internally within our organisations in this way, if we're not actually sharing those outcomes more broadly by contributing to the scholarly literature, then I actually think we're selling ourselves short. So I actually had to present this in front of Alison Brettle in Glasgow and say, I think there's something missing from your framework, and she still talked to me afterwards, so that was nice.
Wasn't too sure what you were saying then.
Yeah. It was one of those moments where I went, oh, okay, let's see how we go with this. But anyway, it's all good. So as I said, I think for you guys, I'm probably preaching to the converted because you're supporting researchers, and the 5 A's model really doesn't look that different from a research lifecycle model. Okay, so this is just one I was looking at earlier in the week. But again, your study design is your articulate. You're set up, you're assembling, you're actually doing the project, you're assessing your evidence, wrapping, then you're applying, you're trying new things, and you're communicating your outcomes. So I guess one of the benefits of being evidence-based in the way that you work is that it is mirroring the way that many of your clients work. And so it gives you a similar language, experience and context to actually demonstrate the value and impact of what you're doing through the use of evidence. I guess the main difference between what researchers in an academic setting might consider evidence and what we consider evidence as librarians is probably the main difference. So Denise Kufiner-Giannakis, almost got it out, from Canada, has done some research around what is valid evidence within libraries. And so she came up with this model that looks at 3 valid sources of evidence that you can use as an evidence-based practitioner in libraries. And all of these are valid. You might use a combination of them, but you don't just need to stick to research evidence as the gold standard. And this was a really big changing point, I think, for the way that evidence-based practice is considered within libraries. So because the movement came out of the health library sector, it was very, very heavily weighted in systematic reviews. Everything had to be based in research evidence. Now, the problem was that we had no research evidence in our profession. There was very, very little evidence, like what we would consider of an evidence base. So to try and do a systematic review when we were doing the first conference in 2005, like there was just nothing to review. There was nothing out there. And that's, I guess, why I'm always kind of going, adding that communicate element to the 5As, because if we don't contribute to the evidence base, we have nothing to stand on. So Denise said, research evidence, absolutely, always start with that. It's a great place to start. However, within our context, local evidence, so things like your local statistics, how many people use your library, how many people attended your sessions, all that sort of stuff. So survey data, feedback, observations. So this is where some of the UX stuff can come in, so observational data, even process, policies, procedures, analytics coming out of your library management system and your research outputs repositories. All of that is local evidence that you can use in this process. Denise also talks about professional knowledge as being a valid source of evidence, and she defines this as things like professional expertise and tacit knowledge, peer networks such as this group, non-research literature, so some of the grey stuff, the blogs, the social media, and really that's benchmarking that we do. We look at, Susan, you might ring up somewhere and say, well, I've got a problem, what do you do? So that people side of what we do, Denise says, is actually, again, another source of evidence that is valid for our profession. Just shout out if this is boring.
No.
So we created a role here. I say we, I didn't actually start until after this was done. So in October 2016, the library here had a very significant revamp, and one of the roles that was created in that time was called the Coordinator Evidence-Based Practice. So Elisa Howlett is in that role. She's on parental leave at the moment, and the wonderful Lindell here has been making it her own, which is fabulous. So I know that some of you have very similar roles in your institution. So I know QT has a quality and planning manager. I know Griffith, you've got Donald. I can't remember what his role is. Yeah. So I know that there are other similar roles around the place working in this space. So for us, though, it's not, so metrics and analytics is certainly part of this role, but what this role has is a broader mandate to really build the evidence-based skills and the evidence base for USQ Library, so that we have what we need to make good decisions and to continually improve our services. So Lisa created this model to describe how she sees this role from having lived this experience. So you can see the role in the middle there with the leadership and the teams. And so she took a version, I guess, of that 5As model and this was her way of, I guess, trying to communicate to others what she does. So for those of you who have ever had to work in a brand new job that no one's ever been in before, sometimes the way that you need to communicate that is challenging, and also trying to define it for yourself. So this was her way of doing that. So what you can see here is her conceptualisation of that. And really she describes it as an enabling role. So she's working, and Linda was doing the same, working with USQ library staff to develop their skills as evidence-based practitioners, and also working to communicate the value and the impact of the library to our stakeholders. So it has a dual internal and external role. I'm sure Linda will comment on the challenges of that. Move on. So I guess how do we do this? Well, very similar to how many of you are probably working in liaison and the like. This is the framework that Carmel O'Sullivan and Helen Partridge used to implement our organisational change. And when I was reviewing their work in this space, I thought, well, this is actually what Elisa and Lyndall have been doing. So again, it's articulating expectations, being really clear. It is a relationship building activity most of the time, same as many of what you do with your stakeholders. It is about communicating benefits and building accountability. This is something that we do. It is about supporting staff development. We don't expect people to get this first up. It is an incremental process. And it is about celebrating small wins. So all of our staff actually have a statement in their position description that says that they will contribute to evidence-based practice here at the library. And we're still struggling with what that means because it does mean different things at different levels. One thing that we will be launching with the staff in November is building on the work of Catherine Hay, who's now gone to Griffith, who's actually developed a scholarship framework that will be explicitly giving staff at different levels some ideas about how they can engage, particularly with scholarship and research literature, research evidence in their daily roles. So watch this space for that. How are we going for time? Good, okay. So I'll just talk about a couple of examples of some of those small wins that we've had, of how we've actually seen people start to take on this way of working. So the first one, again, is another conceptual framework, and I do think it does take time for people to, I guess, think about how they can approach things differently through an evidence-based lens. And the reason that I use this as an example is I guess the story behind this. So this is the content management framework that the Associate Director Content, Tani Pierce, created and presented at BALA at the start of last year. The story behind this, and the reason that I think it's a really good example of someone who took on evidence-based practice and incorporated it into their way of working, is the first version that Tani produced of this. So you can see it looks like a flower. The first version she had one of those blue petals as evidence. It was a standalone thing alongside legislation and licensing, policy and procedures, standards and the like. It was kind of this added on there. What you can see from the actual version that she got to at the end was that evidence informs every single one of those aspects. So she went from an understanding of evidence being an add-on to actually all of those petals are pieces of evidence that inform what the decisions that she's making about the content that we are investing in as part of our support for the university's core business. And I think that's a really, for me, that's a piece of evidence that actually says that someone has taken this on board and incorporated it into their thinking. So then what Tani did, because she's like my poster child for success in this space, is she and Catherine Hay and a few other people who are, I think Leonie was probably involved in this as well, took this conceptual framework and turned it into a practical tool. And so anyone who went to the recent QLOC data workshop, they did, this was featured in their 2-minute update. So this is our selection of, I'm going to get it wrong, it's called the SEEK tool, which is selection of electronic content, but there's another E in there, evaluation. Selection and evaluation of electronic content. So this is the evidence-based decision-making tool that's now used for all our subscription renewals here at USQ. And it's a spreadsheet device. It has a number of tabs, excuse me, and the content staff and liaison librarians work together to populate the different tabs. Each tab generates a ranking, which you can see populates this front matrix and provides an overview of what should happen next. So is it a straight, yes, renew, we love it, it ticks lots of boxes. Is it something we need to engage with stakeholders around? Is it something that we're possibly not going to invest in the future? And again, I think putting that conceptual framework into a practical tool has been very powerful. I think, Lyndall, I know you were involved in the development of this.
Yes.
Did you want to comment at all about how this has changed the way that the liaisons work?
pulling this evidence together has meant that liaison librarians have information at their fingertips that they can then use to communicate with their academics. This has served a very useful purpose in some of those more sensitive conversations around the cancellation or the potential cancellation of some of the resources. I have found it to be particularly successful in encouraging them to change some of the ways that they're using tools to say, look, this looks like this particular resource looks like that it might be heading towards cancellation. As you can see from the evidence, our numbers declined in usage, our cost per view has increased. Let's work together for the next 12 months to see if we can turn that around. And we've had significant success in working together, developing online resources that students can use, tutorials and things, and the academics have been actively involved in that commitment, and we've then been able to show 12 months later through this tool that the evidence says that it's turned around and we can go forwards with renewal. So that process has been highly successful, and it's because of the information that's provided through this tool, which is easily accessible, and the academics like being presented with that information in that way.
Thanks. I'll just skip through a couple of things real quick. Not every evidence-based practice approach we use is high-tech and requires lots of spreadsheets or statistical data. This is an example of a UX experience that we did when we were refurbishing the Springfield campus here, and we called it the Goldilocks experiment. We got example seats, the proposed furnishings, put them out in the atrium in B block with a whiteboard and some chocolate frogs and said, tell us what you think. They told us that none of the furniture was suitable. I think one of the comments was, it reminds me of the beer garden down at Kangaroo Point Pub, which was an interesting feedback. But really, you know, the legitimate comments from students was, you have not provided any height adjustable furniture. I cannot sit in this for a long period of time. Those stories were so powerful that our director was able to go back to campus services and say, we are not accepting any of this furniture, we're going shopping for new alternatives. And so what we got was a whole range of different seating options that were much more fit for purpose. So not everything has to be high tech, it doesn't have to be long outcomes. Yeah, you can use those UX methodologies as part of your evidence gathering process to create really powerful stories or prototypes or interventions that can improve the service that you're using. I must apologise, I've realised, Leonie, I should have got you to give me a good research support-based example, because I need one for my presentation. I just, we'll talk later, make sure I get one for the next time I do this.
Okay.
Yes, because apologies, I don't have a research-based approach. I will just mention that we are at the start of our analytics journey. We took on Alma Primo 12 months ago. We've just implemented Leganto. I think, you know, it's safe to say we're still learning in that particular space and are keen to learn from others in that space. But it's a journey that we're on as well. So just to finish off, I will just mention very briefly a small research project that we have done earlier this year that is also something that we hope to develop further, and I'd be very happy to talk to anyone about this. So one of the things that Elisa particularly struggled with in her new role was actually defining what success looked like for her. And I guess the added challenge is that as an evidence-based practice coordinator, she wanted evidence that she was doing well. So, okay, well, let's actually define that. So what does evidence-based practice look like at an organisational level? So when we went back to the research literature, really the studies that have been done to date over the past 20 years really looked at the individual experience. So what does it look like when an individual starts acting in an evidence-based practice way? We did have a look at literature from the health sciences again, where there has been work done to actually define what an evidence-based hospital looks like. But we couldn't find one that really defined this terribly well for our industry. So we thought we'd better make one. So this was, I guess, the challenge that we set ourselves. We did get ethics approval here at USQ, and what we did was 16 semi-structured interviews with library professionals, many of them from QLOC, so thank you to everyone who gave very generously of their time. What we looked at, what we found in those research interviews was 3 particular themes that came out in the way that people consider how they approach evidence-based practice, who they engage in the process, and again, sort of looking at the types of evidence that they use. So again, we sort of based that on the 5 A's model with that extra element of communication. We looked at the shared understanding, so how well is this represented across the whole library, not just from the leadership, but all the way down. So the people we interviewed were Q6 or above, right up to university librarians. So trying to get that whole. We didn't interview any paraprofessionals or staff below Q6, we really just wanted to look at professional staff. And again, we looked at sort of perceptions and understanding around evidence. So we've proposed a maturity model, which is 5 levels, running from an ad hoc approach to a transformational approach. So what we hope to do with this model is actually put together some toolkits and resources that particularly people in positions like mine can actually evaluate where their library might be within this model and how they might grow the maturity of their library, their academic library, as an evidence-based practice organisation. So there is a preprint available around that, which you're very welcome to actually go and look at the whole model and all the evidence that we gathered around that, which is available on that site there. And hopefully we'll have as I said, I did present this at 2 conferences overseas recently and have submitted an article for publication, which hopefully come out next year. So try to practice what I preach. So yeah, happy to answer any questions, and Lyndall and Tricia are here. They can tell you the real story. And
That's brilliant.
so yeah, look, I hope that's interesting. As I said, I'm sure that most of you are already acting in this way. I think sometimes having some words around it just helps you, and some frameworks around it helps to add value and impact to what you're doing as well.
I found that very interesting, Claire. Very interesting. Thank you. I think, can I have a question? Ask you a question?
Sure.
So in terms of research support, I spend a lot of time speaking, and most of the audience members here would do the same, speaking to the community. Trying to work out what it is they need and then deliver something around what it is that they want. My challenge is always trying to apply an evidence-based approach on whether or not that's a winner or not. And I suppose other people might be in a similar position as well. For example, recently we've got a research umbrella group called Menzies. Under that we've got the Hopkins Centre, and this week we did a bespoke data seminar for them. So it was the professor asked us to come and give it to her because she knows that there's a cultural change about to happen around data, which is great. Then coming to us is best, you know. We had e-research with us, we had a room full of professors, it was well received, they thanked us, you know, they went off. But I know I'm just trying, like, it's a great story, but you know, how do I actually, you know, how do I demonstrate that it has provided impact? It's always been a challenge. But so what I'm going to do is have a look at your model and think about it and have a look to see if I can apply that somehow, or maybe work it in, or I don't know.
So I'm just going to pull this one back up again. I think that's a really interesting point you make, Julie, and I think one of the challenges that we have, and something we've been talking about for a long time, is stats are useful internally, but stories have impact. So if you're thinking about, so you articulated, you very clearly articulated a need, and you put together an intervention. And so I guess, as you said, the challenge is how do you demonstrate the impact of that? So you've got your stats, you know how many people attended. I'm assuming you're doing some kind of post-evaluation survey, because we always do those sort of things, you know, tick, tick, tick. But it's then how do you know, what's the story of that? And how do we capture that, and how do we share that to the right audiences? And it's a challenge. We've talked about this an idea of having a story bank here, some kind of way of capturing those stories. We're looking at reviewing our approach to client feedback to try and get the most out of that we can. We don't have the perfect answer. I know Monash have spent a lot of time teaching all their staff how to actually write narrative stories as part of their performance management program, so that everyone can kind of take what they do and turn it into an elevator pitch for the right person.
Yes. Yeah.
So I guess it is thinking about, you know, what was the problem you were trying to solve? What did you do to solve that, and how do you demonstrate?
And I think your extra C on that circle says a lot, really.
Yeah.
I'm not very good at communicating. I don't think most people would say that they're great, you know, at it and all the time. I've been pushed, you know, that no one knows about that, you know, you push that out. So even though I'm happy to, I need to communicate more, I think.
Yeah.
So your mum has given me food for thought.
Well, thank you, Julie. But I mean, I'm also going to say, you know, what you guys do at Griffith in your team, particularly I know in the work that Kylie was doing around teaching researchers to tell their research stories as narrative. I think we have to be really careful that we are not being holier than thou and saying you need to do this because it's important to you as researchers. We actually have to model it ourselves, and that's why I think that communicate element's really important. We have a whole lot of stories that we can tell, and as I said, it doesn't matter if they're not based on ethics-approved research, because for our industry, some of these other types of evidence are just as valid. So there are stories there to be told, and if we're saying to researchers you should be telling these stories to the appropriate audiences to improve your impact, why don't we do the same? And I think you know this, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. And you guys have some great tools and strategies for doing it.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Does anyone on the online world have any questions for Claire?
Yeah, I did, Claire. It's Leonie. Just one question that popped up in chat. Are you able to share the slides? Is that okay?
Absolutely. Yes, of course.
And the presentation is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it.
I'll if I send them to you, Susan, you can distribute them.
I can, yes.
Absolutely, happy to do that.
Sure. So I have a question. Cultural change. So changing that mindset from having that very metric, measurable evidence to your stories and to your professional knowledge and community, and putting it into also their PDs, which is an interesting move as well. I mean, did you come up against roadblocks? How did you go about socialising it, I suppose, across multiple campuses as well?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go to my maturity model here. And there's actually a whole stack of slides that are hidden here, so I'll send you the unhidden version if you want to really get down into this, because this is cobbled together from my conference presentations. So one of the things that we found with our maturity model research is that to grow the maturity of an organisation, it does depend on leadership. So for us here at USQ, this cultural change has really been driven by our leader, by our director. As I said, she was the one who said, this evidence-based practice is an important value for the direction that I want to take USQ Library. I am going to put this in everyone's position descriptions and we're going to start that conversation. But she also lives that out. So if I go to Carmel with an idea or a proposal, the first question that I will always be asked is, how do you know this is a problem? So I can articulate a need, but I have to challenge my assumptions and provide some evidence as to why this is important. And so because she asks that every single time, that has started to filter down. Because I can't go to her unprepared. Lyndall can't bring something to the library leadership team without having done that background environmental scan, the consultation with stakeholders, with all those kind of just general readiness stuff, again, that we all do, but it is very much, we have been challenged, bring your evidence. How do you know this is a problem? And so I think by setting that, that is just what we now, so 3 years later, the managers know they have to do that. I think the staff realise they have to do that as well. And so that is, I guess, set the behaviour that is expected. I think also the fact that, and I've talked to Elisa about the fact that this is a marathon, we're not, cultural change is never fast, and it is ripples in a pond. So that's why I like to show the leadership that Tani Pierce has demonstrated in content, that she started with thinking about this and then she turned it into a practical application. Now that's had a very significant ripple effect with all of the people who have to engage with that particular process. And I think that, I don't know, not being in that team, maybe Lyndall, you were in that liaison team, maybe you can comment about how having a tool like the SEEK tool has actually created the impetus or started to influence a change with the staff who are working with that.
Very much so. I would say that particularly some of our emerging information professionals who might be in a liaison role for the first time, it's a space where you need evidence to support you developing your confidence in having those sometimes tricky conversations with academics. When you've got that evidence base and the people who've developed it are encouraging you to use that and to take that, and you know that academics are responding well to that kind of information. It's not, we think we want to cancel this because, you know, it hasn't been used very much. That sort of language is not needed anymore. We can base it on information that we know that the academics respect, and their respect for us as professionals has been enhanced because of that too. So that builds confidence. Everyone's consistent. They're using the same approach, and we've seen, I think, an increase in the confidence of those as one example of how they're relating with their academics.
There's a sort of marathon.
Yeah, it's not something you do overnight.
No, and there is a lot of work to populate that. You know, there's a lot of information behind there. It's not just about those metrics and like cost per view and number of downloads. It's also about the functionality, the reporting aspects, the vendor relationship. All that information has been given a weighting, which then produces a ranking that we can then use. But a lot of that information we didn't have at our fingertips before, or it was based on assumptions, or it was based on information that the person in the previous role in content might have shared with you. But we know these things change all the time. So this has really improved, has pulled it all together, and as a consequence improved confidence about making the right decisions in this space. And as with shrinking budgets, we need to know that we're making those right decisions.
So I guess the thing I always say to people is we're not trying to get you to add something onto your work, because most of the time you're probably already doing it. What we are challenging you to do is just to be better. This way of working makes you better at what you do. It gives you more confidence in the decisions that you're making. It gives you the tools that you need to communicate with stakeholders. And it means that the decisions that we're making are sound, they're transparent, they're based on evidence, and they can be communicated to the right audiences. So it's a framework that, as Lyndall said, it's positive, it makes a difference, and it works.
Oh, it's empowering, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. As I said, I'm probably not telling you anything you're not already doing. I guess it just gives you some language and some other things to think about.
Yeah, and to give context, like in the research area, I mean, within our team, in the research support team, we have one email that comes like to all of us to be able to use, and we can see what's coming in. We'll get the request for support. What we do is also look and see, are we getting a bit of a pattern in it? And then we'll target our Research Bites webinars that we run since we've run last year, which have proven very popular, based on that need that we can see. So we're using the evidence of the inquiries coming into us to then structure what are we doing in our Research Bites webinars and get the turn up there.
Yeah.
So it's sort of practice, but it's just actually in that mindset.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good iterative example, because you're looking at trends coming in. So you've got that evidence to make a decision about, well, what should the webinar be about? Then you've got evidence coming out of the webinar as to the level of attendance and engagement, and then what was all going on in the chat at the time. You've got your post-webinar feedback that you're getting as well, and then you're going to iterate that cycle again. Should we run this again? You know, how do we take that forward? Yeah, it's very, very good.
And these are things.
Swipe off them.
These are things that the research team is already doing, but reflecting on that process and communicating what they do to other people. I think clarifies the process again. You check back, can we do it better? Can we do it differently? It's working well. Evaluation.
And and they're communicating that success across the whole library. They're not just doing it in isolation. They're actually sharing that story so that everyone knows that that's what they're doing.
And you're demonstrating your value to the university.
Absolutely, yeah. And so again, and I'm pretty sure, Leonie, you'd be sharing that with the Office of Research and the Graduate Research School and your other stakeholders as well. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. All right, sorry, I'm sure I've taken too much of your time, so I will let you get on with your meeting. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.